Estou aqui em Valdai, na reunião anual do Clube de Discussão Valdai, em Sochi, na Rússia, e tenho hoje a honra de ter como convidado uma pequena conversa a professora Desai, que é uma das grandes especialistas em assuntos internacionais. But let me switch to English. So we're here in Russia, in Valdai, Discussion Club annual meeting, and I have the honor to have Professor Desai here with me to have a short conversation in my channel about the topics, some of the topics that we were discussing here.
Lots to discuss between us, yeah.
So, for example, I'm of the opinion that Russia is the ideal place to discuss the topic of multipolarity.
Yes.
Because to be frank and to be honest with Russia is at the forefront of the struggle for a multipolar world and paying a high price for that. What are your views on multipolarity and the way we're going forward?
Well, I should say that it's my claim that the approach to understanding world affairs that I proposed some 12 years ago now, it's called geopolitical economy, is able to both predict and explain multipolarity. Whereas all the approaches in international relations, whether it is realism or liberalism, or in the IPE, US hegemony, or globalization, these approaches, they don't explain, and they were all gobsmacked by the rise of multipolarity. And the reason is very simple. I basically take a broadly Marxist perspective, although I'm also very critical of the dominant versions of Marxism. And I don't believe that Marx did not understand the state. I don't believe that Marx did not understand the nation state. I think he did. And so I use this understanding, I extract this understanding, and I develop it, and I show that the world was, first of all, the current world order, or the recent world order, was created by imperialism. That since 1914 it has been declining. And it has been declining because in 1914 you had a world war or a long crisis period consisting of two interconnected world wars, which was itself a result of the fact that the world had already become multipolar in the late 19th century with Germany, the United States, Japan, etc., industrializing consciously to contest the dominance of Britain on the world market. So you have so that's already multipolar. By the 1914, you get a situation in which, because capitalist development is no longer possible, because you can't have capitalist development unless there is you can have an imperial periphery, a subordinated periphery, and since the whole world was divided up between the major powers by now, it is not surprising that you got the first socialist revolution. And despite the best efforts of the capitalist West, it survived. It became, by the 1930s, the second industrial power in the world. And since then, the world has gotten progressively more multipolar. Productive capacity has spread around the world. And the way I understand the spread of productive capacity is not because it is transmitted via imperialism or via markets. I understand it is as a conscious effort to undo your subordination. So the Americans, for example, were very conscious of being agricultural appendages to Britain. They wished to industrialize, or at least the Yankees wanted to industrialize. And partly the Civil War was also about whether America would industrialize. So this was a conscious effort to industrialize. Of course, back then you could still have capitalist development because that was combined with imperialism. But after 1914, you had to industrialize without, as I say. So that's why communist or socialist forms have been the most effective at industrialization. The Soviet Union back then and PRC today are the only two countries that have been backward or semi-colonial and have brought their countries to levels of standards of living that are at least in some comparison with what is in the West. This has not happened in most other developing countries. So I'm giving a very long answer to your question, but basically my thesis is that the world started talking about multipolarity only in the 2010s, after the 2008 financial crisis, but it has been in the making for a long time.
What are your views on the role of China in this new phase of history? Do you believe China will replace US hegemony?
Right. So another argument of mine is that the United States, by the early 20th century, the elites of the United States had certainly started nursing the ambition to replace Britain as the managing segment, as they called it, of the world economy. So some version of hegemony. But, after the Second World War, I mean, they got their first chance. After the First World War, they bunged it, then they got a second chance. They were very conscious of this. Henry Luce even called it a second chance, the publisher of Time and Life. He called it second chance in his American Century essay. They then, and for a while it appeared as if the United States was really dominant because thanks to the war, which had destroyed productive capacity elsewhere, but increased it in the United States. The same war, because the United States economy doubled in size in the war years, or Second World War years. So the US certainly, they had the illusion that they would do it, but they were never hegemonic. Remember, the world was already bipolar by then. Plus, it was never sure that the Europeans would go along or the Japanese would go along, etc. You had people like Willy Brandt and Charles de Gaulle, etc., asserting their independence and so on. And so, in any case, the Americans were very conscious that they can never imitate the UK completely. They could never have an empire the size of the UK's British Empire. So they said, it's okay, we'll make the dollar the world's money. This is one of the things we're going to talk about further. So, just as sterling was the world's money before, there was only one design fault in this. Sterling wasn't the world's money because it was Britain's currency. Sterling was the world's money because Britain was an empire. It wouldn't have worked without an empire. Essentially, sterling worked because Britain had the imperial power to extract surpluses from its non-settler colonies, British India being the biggest of them. British India being the biggest of them, and then export these surpluses as capital exports to Europe and to the United States and to its other settler colonies. And it is not at all any surprise that this was the period of the sterling standard between roughly 1870 to 1914, was the period in which these parts of the world industrialized rapidly. Yeah. That being the case, dispensing with having a territorial empire was not going to allow you to make the dollar the world's money. So they didn't have any surpluses to export. So they provided liquidity by running deficits. This was subject to the Triffin dilemma. By 1971, because they lost so much gold, they had to break the gold link. In fact, it had already become a problem in 61. So in my book, Geopolitical Economy, I show very, in step by step, like from 61 onwards, they had to create a gold pool to continue backing the dollar. And then during the 60s, they exhausted every expedient for keeping the link. Having done so, they broke it in 71, and thereafter, my argument is that, the dollar sank in the 70s, as you probably know, and it has only appeared to become the world's money or remain the world's money because the United States has essentially created mechanisms to expand purely financial transactions, having nothing to do with trade or investment, productive investment. Just expand financial transactions so that purely financial demand for dollars counteracts the difference. So it provides an updraft to the downdraft of the Triffin dilemma. And in my humble opinion, I've come a long way but you said is the United States hegemonic. So my simple argument is the United States has never succeeded in being a hegemon in the sense that they meant it, but not for lack of trying. The reason the United States couldn't do it is because the world was already multipolar. There was no way they could acquire this sort of empire. And therefore there was no way they could emulate what Britain had done, even merely on the currency level. And so, for the rest, the early 1990s, people talked about unipolarity, but it was all an optical illusion because the Soviet Union disintegrated not because of anything the West did. There was no victory of the West. the Soviet Union disintegrated because an important section of the elite basically became, they were no longer committed to the socialist project. They defected from the socialist project, and they managed to get their hands on the reins of power, and that was it. Within a few, the heads of Russia, Yeltsin and his head of Ukraine and Belarus got together, signed a piece of paper, dissolved the Soviet Union. Soviet citizens did not want that. Earlier the same year, there had been a referendum, and 80% voted to say they wanted to keep the Soviet Union. Right. So anyway, Soviet Union disintegrated, so there was a sort of optical illusion for a while, but the problem was the United States was already embarked on the path that would lead it to where it is today in its current position of economic decline. Financialization, lack of productive investment, low growth, low investment, etc., etc. That trajectory was always there. And we are simply seeing the further unfolding. I mean, the situation is now so bad that with, the productive decline, increasing economic inequality, all thanks to financialization, you have a level of social inequality which is quite astronomical. You have now, riding on that, social division, political polarization, to the extent that, last year during the summer and, before the elections, people openly talking about the possibility of civil war with the United States. No prosperous country would face that, face that prospect. So that's my answer is that the United States has never been hegemonic. It has tried, and in trying, it has reached a lot of destruction on the world.
But it is true that until recently, the U.S. was a major power. It was never uncontested power, but it was major power.
Sure.
Whereas now we have a situation where the U.S. may no longer be the major power. May have to recognize.
Okay, when you say major, there's always going to be one big power. So the United States was overwhelmingly dominant at the end of the Second World War, for the reasons I just mentioned. From that point on, it has gone from accounting for roughly 50% of world production to 25% and less. So now I also feel there is another thing to be understood about all this. The way in which the United States does its GDP figures, and the way in particular it treats finance as if it were a productive activity, it vastly exaggerates the GDP of the US, so that, and also it needs to exaggerate it, because if it did not, then given the 17% threshold in IMF World Bank, they would lose their veto. Right? So they have to be at least, a couple of few percentage points above 17%. Sorry?
The issue of the IMF is a minor reason.
Minor, but still they want to exaggerate, and also they want to tell their own people, look, your GDP is whatever it is, £50,000 a year on average, $50,000 a year on average. The average American does not feel it.
Let me run something else by you. There's a scenario which might be very concerning for countries like India or Brazil, which is the formation of a tripolar world, where the great powers, the United States, China, and Russia, would more or less share the world in zones of influence. And this, of course, would mean that the BRICS would lose all meaning.
Yes.
And I wonder what we should do if this materializes. So, two questions. Do you think there's a real possibility of a tripolar scenario? And what would countries like Brazil and India and South Africa, Indonesia, need to do if this materializes?
So, the way I look at it, I feel that, yes, I have always argued, I have an article in The Guardian. It must be one of my most cited articles, because I say the BRICS are challenging Western hegemony. But and people often cite it to dismiss it, saying, what's she talking about, sort of thing. Here's a paradigmatic argument of people who are crazy about BRICS, but that article actually says very clearly that they will only be able to continue to contest the power of the West if they pursue a developmental economic strategy, not a neoliberal economic strategy. And in countries like Brazil and India and South Africa in particular, the native capitalist classes are very powerful. They demand more or less some version of neoliberalism. And so I think that their development is held back because of that. In China, while of course there are many powerful capitalists, at the end of the day, the state calls the shots. The party state calls the shots. And that's why, and whereas in India or Brazil or South Africa, it's the capitalists that call the shots, or the United States for that matter. And so their development will be held back. So I think that until that changes, because you see, my argument has always been, remember in the early part of our discussion, I said that Germany or even the United States or Japan, they developed because they had a developmental state. They use protection, they use industrial policy, all of these things, and you have to do that. Free markets and free trade will never bring you development.
No.
We all know that. But that still rules the roost, because our public discourse is controlled by the very corporations that want us to have neoliberalism. You read the Financial Times today, and what you see in it is, like for example, right now, Britain is in a state of absolute crisis. What they need is some kind of active state role in order to develop their economy. But the Financial Times says, oh, Rachel Reeves didn't produce growth, now she's going to tax us, horrible woman, get rid of her, etc. But the thing is, the main thing they don't want is don't tax the rich.
No.
Yeah, that's the main thing they want. And this discourse will continue.
No.
Anyway, to come back to the point, so China will develop. I think Russia is being forced. I think in my humble opinion, if I have a criticism of Putin, it's that he has been in his 25 years of power too neoliberal for my taste. I mean, he has had elements of a developmental strategy. He succeeded in stabilizing Russia after the disasters of the 1990s, but he remains too neoliberal to really exploit the potential that Russia has, to give Russians the economy they deserve. But the war has forced him to go in a more egalitarian, more developmental direction, and I think that's okay, that's good. Whatever works. I mean, if war is making him do that, and I think probably also the increasing closeness between Russia and China will have some sort of demonstration effect. And certainly, you see, the other thing is that you can't have industrial policy unless the state controls the capitalists, and somehow this was possible in Germany, Japan, etc. I leave the US out. I have a different theory about the US, but Germany, Japan, this was possible for various reasons, because a certain pre-capitalist elite managed to transition to industrialization. In China, this is possible. In Taiwan and South Korea, it was possible because the state was essentially the state was the state controlled by a certain type of elite in the pay of the United States, etc., that were able to impose control over the capitalist class. But where this is not possible, like in India or Brazil, they may well fall back. But then I think you will not have a bipolar world, tripolar world. I think you will still have a bipolar world, in the sense that Russia and China will do better because they are pursuing precisely the developmental, non-neoliberal or anti-neoliberal policies. And the US and the West will continue to decline because...
So you see two poles, Russia and China is one pole,
and the West is another one. And the West is on a declining trajectory. These guys will be on a rising one.
Okay, so thank you very much. Foi privilégio, it was a privilege to hear Professor Desai, one of the most important voices in the Valdai discussion and elsewhere.
I'm not sure you're being too kind.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.